Let me reconvene the oversight hearing today. We just finished those votes. They're the last votes for the day. Some of my colleagues might or might not return, but all the comments that you have and any responses to any questions I may have or Mr. Bishop may have will all be part of the record. And if there's additional questions, colleagues will submit them to us and we will forward them to you for a response. So appreciate your indulgence and looking forward to your comments. Let me begin with Mr. Eugene Spiering, Vice President for Exploration, Quaterra Corporation. Sir, your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Eugene Spiering. I'm Vice President of Exploration with Quaterra, Alaska. What I'd like to say is that the federal lands could have a dramatic role in combating climate change while decreasing our nation's dependency on foreign energy supplies, if and only if these lands are managed to encourage and promote uranium mining and the production of nuclear energy. Although wind and solar energy may represent important components of an equation toward the mitigation of carbon dioxide emissions, the large-scale application of these techniques will result in a massive degradation of federal lands and leave a lasting legacy of a failed government program that will embarrass its supporters and infuriate future generations. 20% of this nation's electrical energy is generated by 103 reactors, producing 100,000 megawatts of electricity. Palo Verde, a single generating station located 45 miles west of Phoenix, produces 3,800 megawatts of clean, non-polluting electrical energy, or approximately 3.8% of this nation's consumption. This power station uses only wastewater from the city of Phoenix for cooling, stores all high-level radioactive waste on site, and with all attendant facilities disturbs a total surface area of 4.5 square miles. To produce an equivalent amount of energy by wind generators would require a disturbance of 760 square miles, and solar panels would require 190 square miles. The amount of land disturbed by solar and wind generating systems is enormous when you compare it to nuclear power plants. Wind generators have an average operating capacity of 25% compared to 97% by nuclear plants. When considered with land disturbance caused by thousands of miles of power lines and hydroelectric storage facilities for this intermittent power, the total disturbance of wind power is approximately 160 times the total disturbance of nuclear energy for a similar generating capacity. Solar energy disturbs over 40 times the surface area of nuclear power and costs over 5 times more per kilowatt hour. If 20% of the electrical power used by the U.S. was produced by wind energy, the facilities would cover a surface area of 20,000 square miles, an area slightly less than the entire state of West Virginia. Because the efficient use of wind generators requires a location along hilltops and ridge lines, more than 80,000 miles of horizons in the U.S. would be bristling with windmills and power lines, a sight that many would not like to experience. As the wind generators reach the end of their estimated 25-year life, maintenance may no longer be feasible or possible due to changing economic or political environments, and thousands of miles of rusting junk will remain as a monument to yet another failed energy policy. The U.S. will remain dependent on foreign energy during the waning phases of the world's oil production. The Executive Secretary of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, set up by the United Nations, stated at Bali that I have never seen a credible scenario for reducing emissions that did not include nuclear energy. A recent British white paper on nuclear power concluded that nuclear power is the most cost-effective, low-carbon generation technology available. There are now 196 nuclear power plants with a net capacity of 170,000 megawatts in operation in Europe. There's 14 new units under construction, and moratoriums against building new reactors and mandatory phase-outs of existing nuclear generating facilities are being lifted in Switzerland, Sweden, Italy, England, as well as several Eastern European countries. Approximately 80% of France's electric energy is now generated by nuclear power. 33 reactors are currently under construction globally, and 94 are estimated to either be on order or in the advanced planning stage. There are proposals for an additional 222 reactors. This is the way the world is responding to the climate change and energy. If the U.S. wants to use public lands and truly want to use public lands to fight global warming without the disturbance of enormous land areas and thousands of miles of scenic vistas, the only effective and cost-efficient manner is to encourage and promote uranium mining and the production of nuclear energy on federal lands. This is truly an issue that transcends politics. Nuclear energy is critical to the economy and future well-being of our nation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate your comments. Dr. Mark Harmon, Richardson Chair, Professor in Forest Service, Oregon State University. Welcome and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and subcommittee members for inviting me to testify. My name is Mark Harmon. I'm a professor at Oregon State University. I'm here to represent myself. I've studied the problem of carbon in forests for almost 3 decades, published numerous articles, conducted lots of studies, taught courses on the subject. I'm here to provide information and insights. U.S. forests currently offset about 10% of the nation's greenhouse gas emissions. They could be managed to offset more. Perhaps that amount could be doubled, so we could gain another 10%. But it would be part of a bridging strategy. So forests can't solve the entire problem, and they can only help for a limited time, say about 50 to 100 years. But this is still a significant contribution to the issues we face. There are many misconceptions about carbon in forests. Many proposals are based on these misconceptions, and they're going to prove counterproductive. There's a tendency to only look at the inputs to the forest system or the outputs, depending on what people are trying to sell. I think this is really misleading. As a scientist, we have to look at what's coming in and what's going out simultaneously. A good analogy is for carbon in a forest is like a leaky bucket. Leaky bucket can store carbon, but you have to have carbon coming in, and the amount that stays in depends on the number and size of the leaks. So if we want more carbon in that carbon bucket, we have to put more in at a higher rate, or we have to do something to alter the nature of those leaks. How do we decide what to do? There's a lot of proposals out there. Well, this is sort of like buying a house, but instead of checking for dry rot, we need to check for a few other things. For example, are all the carbon stores being counted? There's a tendency to leave out key pools in the analysis. Is the starting point been specified? How do we know where we're going on any journey if we don't know our starting point? We don't know how far or what direction. How long will it be until the project pays off? Forests are slow systems. They have time lags. Many of the projects that are proposed will pay off perhaps in centuries, and we really need a quicker solution. Are the practices truly renewable? Forests are potentially a renewable resource, but it depends on how they're managed. What other processes will occur when we take an action? For every action, there's an opposite reaction. So how will that affect what happens? And finally, how does this policy work over a large area and over a long time period? We have to evaluate projects in that way. Now, there are a number of actions that'll work, and there's some that won't work. Stopping or slowing deforestation will definitely work. Afforestation, that is adding forests to areas that once had forests and now don't, that definitely works. Lengthening the interval between disturbance or harvest actually increases the amount of carbon stored in a forest. Likewise, taking less each harvest or each disturbance leads to more stores. This is like plugging the holes in the leaky bucket. Couple things that simply don't work. Converting old-growth forests to younger plantations simply doesn't store more carbon. You're taking a system with high carbon stores, converting it one-to-one with lower. There's no way you go from here to there without losing carbon. It's that simple. Now, I have a number of concerns. One is carbon is not the only reason we're managing forests. We clearly need a balance. We heard about treatments for fire fuels and reducing those. Studies are showing that that actually doesn't save much carbon. It actually emits more carbon, the treatments do, than the fires do themselves. However, we need to protect people's homes. We have to have defensible zones. We need to restore some ecosystems back to their original structure. Those are very good reasons to be harvesting and doing treatments, but from a carbon perspective, they're not. We need a thoughtful, transparent accounting system that does not have unintended consequences, and some schemes do have these consequences. We need a reliable monitoring system that can be verified independently. And finally, one last comment is that continued climate change really endangers forests serving as places to store carbon. If we wait too long, we're actually going to have forests become part of the problem and part of the solution, and that's one of my greatest concerns that I have. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Dominick DellaSala, Chief Scientist, Executive Director of Programs, National Center for Conservation Science and Policy. Welcome. Your testimony, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Dominick DellaSala, and I'm the Chief Scientist for the National Center for Conservation Science and Policy in Ashland, Oregon, and I'm also the incoming president of the Society for Conservation Biology North American section. And the SCB has a global membership of over 11,000 scientists and resource managers, two-thirds of whom reside in the United States. Throughout my testimony, I emphasize that the longer we delay action on climate change and the more we release dangerous greenhouse gases, or GHGs, into the atmosphere, the worse the situation will become for Americans and the rest of the world. The rapid climate change we are experiencing is a result of three factors. One, human-caused releases of several gases that contribute to the warming of the Earth. Two, the loss and degradation of forests and pollution-related changes to the oceans. And three, changes in ice, precipitation, water temperature, wind, and currents caused by climate change that themselves speed up the climate change process, which is called feedback loops. Major shifts in these changes can be tipping points that cause chain reactions in global weather patterns and other climate change events. So as a safety net for humanity, some of our most able scientists have called for a target of the equivalent of 350 parts per million of GHGs in the atmosphere as a midterm safe limit. We're at currently 387 parts per million CO2 and climbing at a rate of 2 parts per million per year. The further away from the 350 parts per million limit we get, the more likely it is that climate change will trigger truly catastrophic events. Depending on how you measure them, federal public lands cover about 30% of our nation's land base. They're strongholds for essential and irreplaceable benefits such as biodiversity, clean water, flood control, and carbon sequestration. These benefits are severely threatened by climate change and certain management activities. But these lands also hold part of the climate change solution as well. Now, I would like to emphasize 3 main points for my testimony, which also includes 14 closing recommendations and 3 supporting documents. First, the nation needs a comprehensive national goal with early and aggressive measures to reduce GHGs and particulate emissions to reach a 350 parts per million equivalent target. There are 2 measures that Congress can require of federal agencies to contribute to that goal. First, this committee should direct the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to report back on what authorities they already have under existing laws to reduce net GHGs and how they initially plan to use them. Second, Congress and/or the administration should convene a committee of scientists to determine how best to retrofit existing regulations and statutes to address cumulative causes and impacts of climate change arising from GHGs and land use. As an example, Congress can direct federal agencies to measure the likely impact of GHGs from actions on public lands and compare alternatives as they comply with NEPA. Alternatives can be selected to optimize carbon sequestration and/or reduce emissions. This is especially important in evaluating cumulative effects from energy resources, livestock grazing, and logging on public lands in a climate change context. Second, the primary goal of public lands should be the protection of ecosystem services, biodiversity, and optimization of carbon storage. Federal agencies should be guided by the same consistent mission in this regard and provide the core for a network of public and private lands managed for ecosystem services. To illustrate how far away from this vision we are, if you look at the recent decision by the Bush administration to rescind the NIFMA wildlife viability regulations and the fact that BLM doesn't even have a requirement to protect viable populations of wildlife. Also in my region in Western Oregon, the BLM Western Oregon Plan revisions, or so-called WOPR, would increase old-growth logging by 400%, releasing the CO2 equivalent of driving 1 million cars for 132 years while further stressing our ecosystems. Now, to help public lands adapt to and mitigate against climate change, Congress should direct the agencies to retain existing stores of carbon in mature and old forest as the nation's carbon trust, reduce existing ecosystem stresses from land management, and maintain viable populations. My third and final point is that Congress should set more conservative limits on both BLM and Forest Service energy development. The BLM recently has indicated it will allow additional oil and gas development across vast areas on top of extensive areas already leased. Congress should call for a full accounting of emissions and ecosystem degradation of already developed leases to better understand and mitigate these impacts. Now, in light of the likely impacts of additional drilling, let's not make matters worse. Congress should therefore impose a moratorium on further lease development and require revocation of any leases that are incompatible with climate and biological security. In closing, Mr. Chairman, as you and the subcommittee contemplate legislation for public lands to adapt and mitigate to climate change, we urge that public lands be managed for their irreplaceable contribution to biodiversity and ecosystem services by developing a national comprehensive plan to bring down and keep GHG emissions at safe levels, reduce our dependency on fossil fuels while developing renewable energy sources, and ensure the continuation of a biologically diverse and robust system of national forest and BLM lands. Thank you, and I look forward to questions later.
Thank you. Now, let me now ask Dr. Jack Williams, Senior Scientist, Trout Unlimited. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. My name is Jack Williams, and I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to provide my views as Senior Scientist for Trout Unlimited on the role of federal lands in combating climate change. I've held research and management positions in both the BLM and Forest Service, so this issue is very close to my heart. Trout Unlimited, as you may know, is the nation's largest cold water fisheries conservation group dedicated to the protection and restoration of trout and salmon and their watersheds. In my testimony today, I would like to focus on three main areas. First, a brief description of how climate change is likely to impact national forests and public lands and how these impacts are already being felt. Second, I'd like to describe the resources, both natural resources and people in nearby communities that are being affected by these climate change. And then third, briefly describe how the problems can be solved. That is, if we act now and utilize the best available science. If we fail to act, the cost can be considerable and our national forests and public lands may be irreparably harmed. I think most of you are familiar with the likely impacts of climate change on national forests and public lands. The impacts will be severe and include things like a general warming trend, increased evaporation, drying of forests and grasslands, increased wildfire intensity and frequency, reduced snowpack, more winter precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, earlier peak flows in rivers, less consistent stream flows, more pronounced storm events including winter flooding, and more prolonged drought. Already from a fisheries perspective, we see a lot of these changes in terms of changes to stream hydrographs, earlier stream flows, and even earlier emergence of aquatic insects and changing fish migrations. Okay, what resources and user groups are going to be impacted? Well, a whole broad spectrum, not just fisheries and wildlife and overall biodiversity, but outdoor recreation opportunities, drinking water supplies, both quantity and quality, livestock raising, timber harvest, other resource extraction, and indeed the safety and economic well-being of nearby communities. It is important to realize that we cannot prevent these climate-driven disturbances to our national forests and public lands, but it's equally important to realize that we can moderate the impacts of these changes and reduce the stress to our natural resources and adjacent human communities. Okay, let me focus for just a minute on 3 specific problems that our public lands will face and what we can do about them. The first is water resources and water quantity. Well, basically, to help protect water supplies and maintain stream flows, we need to essentially do the following things. We need to protect the high elevation wet meadows, the wetlands, the riparian areas, and the riverine floodplains. Why? Because these are the areas that are sort of the natural sponges in our watersheds that slow the water and release it into the groundwater. So they're also our groundwater recharge zones, which are critical from a water supply standpoint. So the proper functioning condition of those habitats will be increasingly important as snowpack diminishes. Water quality. To protect water quality, we need adequately sized streamside riparian zones and adopt management standards that emphasize aquatic system protection. These stream zones should be large enough to provide shade to streams, but also buffer upslope erosion and management. In terms of increasing floods, we need to help guard against flood damage by reconnecting rivers to floodplains. Again, focusing on those riparian and floodplain areas, because those are the areas where floodwaters can move into, dissipate their energy, and also, again, recharge those groundwater systems. In general, the agency should strive to improve the overall health of the land, seeking to restore conditions that allow the land to help withstand and recover from anticipated climate change-driven disturbances. Okay, then how can we deal with the uncertainty of climate change? A solid monitoring and adaptive management program will be vital. Our ability to adapt is limited by 2 things. First, our ability to detect change, and secondly, our capacity to understand its consequences. Forest Service and BLM monitoring programs are not adequate for these tasks. To address that shortcoming, the federal government needs a new science initiative among USGS, the Forest Service, other federal agencies, academic institutions, and others to help design a program to really help interpret the results of an integrated monitoring program across multiple jurisdictions. So in conclusion, I would say that the actions described in my testimony have a considerable price, but they also have broad benefits, not only to maintaining biological diversity, but to sustaining the ecological services critical to meeting the needs of recreationists, ranchers, other user groups, and ensure the well-being of nearby communities. In the end, we must ask ourselves, what is the cost of inaction? What will it cost to repair damage to our national forests and public lands? I would argue that it is less costly and more beneficial to address these concerns in the near term than to wait until increased climate-driven disasters befall our lands. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Spiering had to leave early for a commitment. I think the hearing went longer than the time he had. And I'll be forwarding some questions to him. I think he made a comment about nuclear power, i.e. through uranium mining, is a non-polluting activity. And so my question is going to be about Moab and the 16 million tons of waste that is yet to be dealt with, the 500 abandoned mine on Navajo country that EPA now is doing in tiers to see which is the priority. They're going to begin the cleanup and closure of those abandoned mines, and the orphan mine near the Grand Canyon that continues to be a problem and polluted the watershed there. Those are a consequence of direct uranium mining, and I understand that nuclear power is not an absolute yes or no proposition that we're dealing with, but there are consequences, and we're going to forward the questions to him about those consequences. In addition to, is there any public land, i.e. the Grand Canyon, in which uranium mining should not be allowed? I think that's an appropriate question to ask as well. Dr. Harmon, you raised some serious concerns about the drying of the forest and the subsequent increase in wildlife frequency and intensity. Could you give us your prediction of what we will face in the upcoming fire seasons due to climate change, and how land management agencies can better be prepared to deal with that reality?
Well, fire is really a hard thing to predict, Mr. Chairman. But it's likely, if the current trends continue, that yes, we will have warmer, longer growing seasons. That's good for tree growth in part. But in the West, where we have in the summer a shortage of water, that may also mean a longer period of dry fuels, and so there could be larger fires. They may or may not be more severe, because only some ecosystems are fuel levels really higher than we might expect naturally. It's hard to say what to do, because it's starting to create a problem that's very, very expensive to try to solve. I think we have to concentrate our efforts on protecting housing and things where people could lose economic value in their lives. That would be one place. Where we can restore a natural fire regime, we should try to do it, because it's just cheaper. That can conflict with the first priority, protecting people, but there are areas where this could go on. One of the things is people have this sense that there's a tremendous loss of carbon in a fire. And as my written testimony shows, the range is about 5% of what's in an ecosystem to about 15%. It's not huge. The trees don't really burn up. If they burned up, people wouldn't be fighting about timber salvage. So, for one thing, is the fires are not, people don't like them, they're very emotional about them, they're very dangerous, but they're not nearly as bad for the carbon cycle as often is portrayed.
Thank you. Dr. DellaSala, you mentioned that global warming is already affecting species and natural resources across the country. And let me ask you, relative to the public lands, you talk about changing the mission of Forest Service and BLM. Do you think we need to change the Organic Act or the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act? Can we accomplish some of this through regulatory, within the regulatory framework, or is that a statutory issue as well?
Well, thank you for that question. And as I've indicated in my testimony, there are a number of ways that this subcommittee could address this. One is that you could ask the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture whether or not they have the existing structures to respond to climate change and some of the challenges that we're now seeing. And two is that you could request that a committee of scientists be convened that would take a look at the whole regulatory package within the context of climate change and cumulative impacts. So those are two immediate things. There are other measures, too, that I would recommend, such as working with the Obama administration to restore the National Forest Management Act viability clause for maintaining viable populations on federal lands, and working with Representative Kind to make sure that a similar measure is introduced for BLM lands, which are not managing their wildlife for viable populations. So there are a number of different ways to look at it, but I think the challenge here is that a lot of those statutes were put together in the early part or the mid part of the last century, and quite frankly, they weren't up to the task of what we're seeing now in the 21st century with the increased stress loads that we put on these ecosystems in addition to the climate change impacts.
Thank you very much. Dr. Williams, as we focus on the adaptation of our public lands to a changing climate, in your testimony, you talk about that healthier systems are more resilient to the change. What actions could land managers be focusing on today to restore and rehabilitate wetlands and watersheds?
Well, I think there's, you always try to do as many things with the one stroke as you can. If we know we're going to have a lot of fires on the landscape, One of the systems that we need to work on are our road systems. The national forests and BLM public lands have huge road networks, and many of these roads are essentially in a maintenance backlog. And from a fire standpoint and an aquatic system standpoint, the culverts are undersized, the roads are poorly managed, and we need to upgrade those systems, especially in areas that are likely to fail as a result of fire and then subsequent erosion. So the road network greatly influences the hydrologic, the stream network. The culverts and the road crossings are critical areas because these can build up with sediment and debris and kind of blow out. And so on the one hand, the road network is a critical element to focus on. The other part of that is really the meadow riparian habitats along streams and along meadows that are, again, these kind of natural sponge areas that both soak up the energy and soak up the water and then recharge the aquifers during rain. And with reduced snowpack, more winter precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, the health and condition of those lands are going to be absolutely critical to maintain base stream flows.
Let me thank you. Your full written testimony is part of the record, and if colleagues, as I had mentioned earlier, have questions, they'll submit them, and we will forward them to you for your responses in writing. Thank you very much, and thank you for the time. Let me invite the next panel, please. You're going to introduce. Thank you very much, and let me ask our colleague, Mr. Holt, for the introduction of one of our panelists, and then I'll...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for an important hearing that you've been undertaking today, and I thank you for inviting the next distinguished and very capable witnesses. I'd like to introduce to you and to the committee Mr. Rick Ridgeway. He is a legend among climbers, a leading climber and adventurer, the first American to reach the summit of K2, a participant in the first mountaineering, Western mountaineering expedition to Bhutan, person who scaled the first big wall climb in Antarctica. So he has a number of climbing pelts on the wall and has really a well-earned reputation among explorers. Mr. Ridgeway is also a documentary filmmaker and a photographer and a writer. And in his free time, Rick Ridgeway is the Vice President of Environmental Programs and Communications at Patagonia. He develops, implements, and promotes the second two of the company's three-part mission statement: to make the best product, cause no unnecessary harm, and to use business to inspire and implement solutions to the environmental crisis. Mr. Ridgeway, I believe your experiences give you a unique view of our environment, sometimes from above, sometimes from the side, sometimes from right in it, and a view of the need to preserve it. So we welcome you today, and Mr. Chairman, I again thank you for setting up this hearing.
Thank you, sir. And let's begin with Mr. Ridgeway, Freedom to Roam. Your testimony, sir. Thank you.
The earlier introduction that Representative Capps so graciously gave to me and to our initiative, Freedom to Roam, which, while was initiated at our company Patagonia, is now its own independent organization. And I would suggest to the group that we're not what you might expect. We're the only organization I know of that brings together groups from the Department of Defense and the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, business leaders from Walmart and Microsoft, energy providers from BP America, hunting and angling groups, including the National Wildlife Federation and the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, conservationists from the Defenders of Wildlife, and scientists from the Wildlife Conservation Society. We know that the planet is warming. We've read the IPCC prediction that if nothing is done to adapt to changes that are now recognized as inevitable, we could lose 40 to 70% of the species on our planet. And a change on that scale is uncharted territory. And no one, including our best scientists, fully understands the consequences that loss would have on our own species. But those scientists do know that to adapt to these inevitable changes, most of the wildlife in our United States needs the ability to move. It needs the freedom to roam around in habitats, many of which are on public lands. But if habitats become fragmented by development or shifted by climate change, then many won't survive. But there is a solution, and it's based on best science, and it's this idea of connecting landscapes to give animals the freedom to roam. But also, I want to stress, to give people the freedom to hunt and fish and to hike and to camp and to ranch and even to do business in ways compatible with wildlife. Now, before we look into how we propose to achieve that, let's take a pause to look at where this idea of wildlife corridors came from. And it was established when Tom Lovejoy, an acclaimed biologist here in Washington, began a long-term study in the Amazon.
So in the late 1970s, my Brazilian colleagues and I a grand experiment in landscape ecology. And we persuaded those who were clearing the forest to do it in a way that gave us a series of forest fragments of different sizes. And that enabled us ultimately to demonstrate how big a national park should be. That's a big number. In the Amazon, it's about 1,000 square kilometers. So the question that also arises is, what do you do if you don't have such a size? Well, then the answer is pretty obvious, actually. You connect the fragment to other fragments to larger forests. You create, in a sense, wildlife corridors so animal species can move around.
And to illustrate the importance of connectivity and corridors as an adaptation strategy for climate change, I want to show you the story of the lynx. Now, the present-day range of the lynx looks like this. But what might happen as the planet warms? Well, scientists using the most advanced tools currently available predict that the habitat of the lynx is going to shift here by 2060, and it's going to go here by 2100. Now, you can see that these marooned habitats are likely too small to sustain lynx populations. So what do? Well, you connect the fragments with wildlife corridors. But it's not only predators like the lynx that need the freedom to roam, but it's migrating songbirds, counted by the millions by bird watchers. It's game birds and waterfowl, valued by millions of sportsmen. It's big game species that all of us celebrate. Now take the pronghorn antelope. This is the fastest big game animal on the continent. It can run 60 miles an hour. And every fall, one group of pronghorn leave the Teton National Park and migrate south 170 miles to their wintering grounds, where now instead of sagebrush, they encounter hundreds of recently installed gas wells. But there are solutions, from new technology that, as we've heard earlier, allows gas wells to be clustered, 25 and more on a single pad. And this gives the pronghorn more room to roam. Well, it's not just gas wells, however, but pronghorn also have to crawl under fences. And again, there is a solution in fences that are designed with a minimum clearance and a bottom wire with no barbs that allow the pronghorn to freely crawl under the fences. So these are solutions, and solutions is what our coalition, Freedom to Roam, is about. With a steering team that includes corporations, some of them Fortune 50 companies, that includes conservation organizations known for their broad-based inclusion, and government organizations representing every state's role in providing solutions to protecting wildlife. But what are those solutions, and what is the roadmap to protection? Well, we think and propose that it has 5 steps. First, to define corridors, to develop a legal definition for corridors, and 2, to use that legal definition to identify critical corridors across the United States. Third, to give designations to corridors that qualify, beginning with the public lands, and 4, to work with private landowners to come up with tools and incentives to live and ranch in ways compatible with wild animals, and 5, to allocate funds to support science, to support projects such as road crossings and wildlife fencing, to support private landowners. And we know this will require the cooperation of private citizens, of businesses, conservation groups, and of course governments. But we also believe we can do this because we're all sensing this new climate, this climate of cooperation that's driven by climate change, that we're all in this together, that we all live on this same planet, and together we can preserve the health of our home for ourselves and for our children and for the wildlife that's part of our American identity. So, Chairman, thank you so much, members, for the invitation here to share with you this vision that Freedom to Roam has.
Thank you very much. Next, let me ask Ms. Lynn Jungwirth, Executive Director, Watershed Research and Training Center. Welcome. Look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm very happy to be here. I work with the community forestry folks around the West, and we've been working on forest restoration on public lands for many years. Oh, thank you. I'm here today to talk a little bit about federal land's role in combating climate change and try to respond to your challenge at the opening to talk about adaptation, mitigation, and key laws. So I have my written testimony, but I'm just going to try to respond to what you ask us. So adaptation, what are we doing to try to adapt to this climate change? I live in the Trinity Forest. It's a frequent fire forest. We are seeing rapid change. We're converting to brush fields on the southern slopes because once the forest burns, it cannot seem to regenerate itself naturally. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to put in a series of strategic fuel breaks that would keep the fires contained so that they never gain that speed and that intensity they get as they get larger. We are trying to work on the riparian areas because the riparian areas are the areas that are moist enough to slow down a slow-moving fire and to help you protect that. We are trying to put fire buffers around the spotted owl habitat that we're supposed to be protecting and the coho habitat. In those forests, we have very steep mountains, and when the fire denudes the land, the ground, the erosion that happens in the key coho habitat is pretty horrific, and it doesn't just happen for 1 year, it goes on and on for years. So we're working very, very hard on forest restoration to try to deal with and to help the forest stay resilient in the face of climate change. In terms of climate mitigation, the greenhouse gas mitigation, the forest fire that was in California last year, the Air Quality Board did a little study for us. They figure 84 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions. So that's 12 million vehicle years. So when they put carbon trading in to try to help cap and trade carbon emissions, God is going to be having to come up with billions of dollars every year. California wants to get to a level of 427 million tons, 84 million tons in 1 year of wildfire. How in the world can you affect the man-made carbon and overcome that 20%? So we have to mitigate it, and we have to slow down the carbon from those fires. When we do that, our people are putting those into wood pellets. They're making electricity with it. There's a little guy up in Siskiyou County, has a nursery. Made some wood pellets to burn for his nursery heat, gives him CO2 saturated air for his nursery. He's got better plants. Took those pellets, used pyrolysis, made some diesel. He's generating electricity. He's generating electricity on a scale that you can move through the local wires. A 2 megawatt plant, 2 megawatts of power, you can move through the local wires. You do not need huge new transmission lines. So these are the people who are on the ground, who are trying to be a world-class workforce to try to restore, maintain, and protect the public lands. So that's kind of where we are with adaptation and mitigation. In terms of the key laws, we firmly believe that the Organic Act, that NEPA, that the Multiple Use Act are so out of date as to be the impediment.
Thank you very much. Our last panelist, Mr. Forrest McCarthy, Public Lands Director, Winter Wildlands Alliance. Welcome and look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the subcommittee. I am Forrest McCarthy. I live in Jackson Hole in the great state of Wyoming, and I am the Public Lands Director of Winter Wildlands Alliance. And I've been an alpine, mountain, and backcountry ski guide for almost 20 years. During my travels, I've become the first person to set foot on B-15, the largest iceberg ever recorded, near the Ross Ice Shelf in Antarctica. As a physical geographer, I studied how rapidly warming temperatures are transforming land cover in Arctic Alaska. Today, I'm testifying on behalf of the Outdoor Alliance, a coalition of 6 national member-based organizations that represent the interests of millions of Americans who climb, hike, paddle, mountain bike, backcountry ski, and snowshoe in our nation's public lands, waters, and snowscapes. Not unlike indicator species, human-powered outdoor pursuits can be seen as indicator activities because we are some of the first people to experience the impacts of climate change in our public lands. A personal loss for me is the legendary black ice couloir in the northwest face of the Grand Teton. Due to warming temperatures, all that ice is now gone, and future generations of mountaineers will never have the opportunity to ascend one of the most renowned alpine climbs in North America. Our community's self-interest in combating climate change is coupled with the insight on how federal lands can help us meet this challenge, and we are honored to share those with you today. First, federal lands must facilitate ecosystem adaptation that protects flora and fauna, but also takes into account the human aspects of the landscape. Adaptation policy should include preserving and protecting large tracts of open space, much of it on federal land. Our system of national trails and the critical open space through which they run, from the Appalachian Trail to the Pacific Crest Trail, is a model of how this can be achieved. Taking care of our ecosystems must take precedence over how we enjoy and profit from them. But there is an argument for conceptualizing adaptation goals and policies a little more broadly. Because ecosystems mean something to people, our adaptation policy should take into account how climate change will impact federal lands as these lands relate to sustainable human uses, including the associated impacts to the outdoor recreation economy. Second, federal lands must simultaneously be protected as carbon sinks and thoughtfully developed for renewable energy. Federal lands contain millions of acres of forests and grasslands, so they will not only store carbon, but also remove it from the atmosphere. Federal lands can thus be used to combat climate change by maximizing the amount of forest and grassland. We support a portfolio approach to land designation that includes wilderness areas, national scenic areas, national recreation areas, and especially open space designations in close proximity to population centers. To adequately reduce carbon emissions, alternative energy sources and technologies must be developed and pursued on federal land. While the outdoor community welcomes the development of clean, renewable energy, we insist that this path is pursued in a balanced manner that takes into account other aspects and values of federal land. An example of this balance is the Federal Power Act's Equal Consideration Clause. When rivers are developed for hydropower, the Equal Consideration Clause ensures that the needs of fish and wildlife are addressed, recreational opportunities of the river are provided, and local communities' needs are considered. The role for federal land is thus aggressively combat the increase in atmospheric carbon, but not at the expense of other inherent values of the land. Third, healthy federal land is our common ground and can unify all Americans for the present and future challenges associated with combating climate change. Stabilizing our climate will require change and sacrifice, but there must be some social rewards woven into the plan to assure that the public is vested in the effort over the long term. Healthy public lands provide a tangible benefit for our sacrifices and commitment to protecting our climate. Our public lands provide the opportunity for Americans to stay connected to the natural world, and through this connection, will we have the commitment and collective endurance to achieve this goal of stabilizing our climate. In conclusion, we believe that facilitating ecosystem adaptation, protecting carbon sinks while supporting careful renewable energy development, and motivating long-term public support for these challenges through enhanced federal lands can be pursued in a manner where they can coexist and complement each other. When climbing North America's highest mountain, Mount McKinley, climbers make momentous sacrifices. The climb is expensive, grueling, and dangerous. Yet every year, over 1,000 aspiring summiters embrace the challenge. Yet every year, fear tempered with planning and commitment, the suffering with the splendor of the view from the top of North America, like climbing McKinley, the road to a stable climate will be challenging and committing. There's a great deal of fear from inaction, but we have a great deal to gain by being thoughtful, decisive, and doing this right. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Let me ask a couple of questions. Mr. Ridgeway, going back, referencing that fourth point about the involvement of private landowners in the process of identification and development of corridors, the discussion today has been about public lands, but the question is, how should private landowners be involved and connected to this process that you pointed out? They're an essential part of as well.
Yes, they, as you point out, Mr. Chairman, private landowners will be very essential to the protection of wildlife corridors because, of course, so many of those corridors are on private lands. And I think we'll be discovering with more clarity just where those overlaps are as we begin this process of identifying further all the wildlife corridors in the United States and across North America. But our coalition wants to bring tools to the table, tools that can be used by private landowners to allow them to continue to live and ranch on those lands, but do it in ways that are consistent with long-term survival needs of wildlife. And tools such as conservation easements are very useful towards those goals. And we want to work together collaboratively as a broad-based group, again, to bring the resources to the table that can be used in that case by private landowners to, again, ranch and maintain, manage their properties in ways consistent with the wild animals that are on them.
Are there particular wildlife corridors that Freedom to Roam can identify now?
Yes, there's many. And they come in two different categories. There's corridors that migrating animals use to get from A to B seasonally. There are also corridors that non-migrating animals use to get between their different populations, which, if cut off, maroon those populations, as you saw on that map with the lynx. Perhaps one of the best known and identified and understood corridors in the United States is the path of the pronghorn that I showed you briefly in our presentation. And that one's well known because wildlife biologists have collared animals and followed them as they've gone from beginning to end on that corridor, and they know the boundaries and the measure of it very accurately. And interestingly, that corridor crosses public lands. It starts in a national park. It then goes across the Bridger-Teton National Forest, and it then enters into public lands, private lands, excuse me. And most of those are ranches, but some of those ranches have already been subdivided, forcing the animals into the forest where they prefer not to go. antelope, because of their predators, like to stay in the open. They have eyes that can see for miles, and they hate to going in the trees. And that path of the pronghorn corridor has almost been permanently disrupted because of two subdivisions of ranch lands that, if given the resources, might have been able to avoid that subdivision. And that is, again, the resource that we want to bring to the table for private landowners.
Thank you. Mr. McCarthy, the public lands are being called upon to help address our energy needs, and part of this whole discussion in this full committee and subcommittee will be the calls for increased oil and gas extraction. There's also the creation of a new capacity for nuclear energy production, and which involves uranium mining near places like the Grand Canyon, for instance. But there's also discussion about creating a balance between the extraction protection side of this question. The user groups you represent, the outdoor industry that you represent, how would you define that balance?
Mr. Chairman, I think the best model for that, as I mentioned earlier, is the Federal Power Acts with the equal consideration clause that was used on rivers in the history of damming rivers, that in future river projects for energy, other attributes, including ecological and recreation, need to be considered. I also think a good model is to look at these things proactively. I know there's an organization in Wyoming called the Biodiversity Conservation Alliance, who has already, in a GIS, mapped out all the important areas for wildlife in the state of Wyoming, and then overlaid with the wind potential to say, these are the areas that have critical wildlife value and not appropriate for wind development. These are areas that we need to proceed cautiously, and these are areas where they don't have any conflict.
Regulatory and statutory changes, would that be part of the equation in developing balance?
Well, you asked earlier in the hearing appropriate of NEPA, and I think, in that consideration of those projects, where environmental assessment of these projects is the appropriate application of that.
Thank you. Ms. Jungwirth, you mentioned your experience in your community of Trinity, and could you talk to us about the impacts that you've seen of climate change that you witness on federal lands from that very close perspective that you have?
Sure. We've seen the size of fires move from a 100-acre fire to a 200,000-acre fire in the period of about 40 years. We have increased COPD in our elders. As the Hooper Reservation, which is next door to us, they've really documented that. We have seen dewatering of streams. We have seen forests converting to brush fields. Last year we lost our tourism and recreation industry that we were trying to diversify to as a public land community, because nobody wants to come and look at an ashtray and breathe smoke. We will lose our lake resort tourism business this summer because of the low water flows. And we're also trying to diversify our economy by growing grapes. And the grape crop, they won't press smoked grapes. They actually test for smoke in California to see how bad it is for your grapes. And our grape crops were thrown in the garbage can. So it affects every single aspect of our lives.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Holt, any questions, comments?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, if I may. Mr. Ridgeway, first of all, thank you for coming, and I commend you on your work for Freedom to Roam. It seems to me that this is a pretty complicated idea. I mean, in some sense, it's very simple. You just have these corridors or a string of emeralds or however you want to call it. But it seems to me it's really very complicated to figure out how you can have a corridor that, I mean, clearly if it's going to be interrupted with fences, well, you might make those fences passable for pronghorn or lynx, but not for other, I mean, if you design it to make it passable for them, it might not be passable for other species. And so I wanted to find out how well developed the idea is. I mean, I know there's certainly some ecologists at Princeton I know and at other places who have been studying these things, but how thoroughly is it studied so you can find an optimal design for these things so that they will pass all the critical species, and how do you determine the length? You talk about the pronghorn, you need a couple 100 miles, I guess. But for other species, you might need 1,000 miles. And so, you know, where does one get the information that puts all of this together to come up with an optimal design for how the corridors would be put together?
Well, it has to be, of course, based on best science, and that science is provided by wildlife biologists. And as you pointed out, it is specific to species, that multiple species will use certain corridors, like the pronghorn corridor is also used by mule deer migrating north and south. And in fact, the mule deer don't have problems with fences because they can jump right over them. Pronghorn are forced to crawl under because as an animal that runs very fast, they can't jump high, so they have to go under. Again, the solutions are species specific. And again, in the case of mule deer and pronghorn in that area in Montana and Wyoming, one of the critical factors in protecting their corridors is also protecting them with road crossings. In the case of both species, they can be lured and directed by fencing that they can't get over under into underpasses. But the underpasses have to be designed, again, to accommodate the needs of a specific species. In the case of a pronghorn, the underpasses have to be wide enough and open enough and not so tunnel-like that they're inhibited from crossing under them. A mule deer will be is easier to actually get to go through an underpass. And there are many underpasses that have been finished recently in southern Wyoming that are very successfully being used by mule deer. There's much work to be done on by species to, again, identify their specific needs, not only where the corridors are, but what their needs are within those corridors. So that is work still to be done. We believe that our coalition can provide a great benefit by organizing many of the groups regionally around the country that are working on different aspects of this. They're often working independent of each other. One of the great jobs that needs to be done, for example, is to identify where their habitats are going to shift to under different global warming scenarios. There's several groups around the country that are starting on that right now. We're discovering that they don't even know about each other yet. Scientists working on habitat shift under global warming scenarios here in Washington, D.C., with the Geological Survey, for example, don't know that colleagues out in California at the Academy of Sciences are doing the same thing. So we can provide a great service by coordinating those groups regionally and internationally that are beginning the work, all the work that has to be done. And it's very extensive. It's going to take some years, I think, to achieve the final goals, but it has to get started now.
Which brings me to my next question. On what time scale are we talking about? If we're going to accommodate, you know, varieties of species and bring together all of this information, as you say, it's going to take a long time. How much time do we have? What is the time scale for which we will acquire land or acquire rights of way or whatever else needs to be done?
In my testimony, I said we're entering unknown territory here. We don't know the answers to those questions precisely. The shift that you saw for the lynx was it was using the IPCC models developed in 2007 for the most pessimistic predictions that were out there at that time. We're 2 years later. The pessimistic predictions that you saw up there are now the middle of the ground ones. That is the average that we chose to present to you. It's a shifting target. There's not much time on this. We have to get started right away. We believe the first steps, as I said in my testimony, is to work together with your subcommittee especially to achieve a definition of what wildlife corridors are. That's the first step. With a definition of what they are, corridors can begin to be identified and then designated. And we would very much like to work with your subcommittee to figure out how to make that happen. Those are the first steps, we believe.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let me ask the gentlelady from Wyoming, Ms. Lummis, for her questions or comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to welcome Mr. McCarthy to our hearing. This is a fellow gentleman from Wyoming, and I'm delighted to see you here. And I'm pleased that you've chosen to share your time and expertise with us. You know, as I do, that tourism is Wyoming's second largest industry and contributes $2.6 billion to Wyoming's economy. And a lot of that spending occurs on activities on public lands. So I'm delighted that you've chosen to join us today and speak of your experiences in Wyoming and the West. Here's a quote that I'm going to give to you from Gifford Pinchot, who was, of course, the first chief of the Forest Service. "Conservation is the application of common sense to the common problems for the common good." Very much a wise use doctrine, and it essentially serves as the last century's Forest Service motto. Much of your testimony follows a similar line of thinking, that as we pursue new renewable energy projects and fuels reduction strategies and other public land uses, that we do so with moderation in mind. So my question, Mr. Chairman, is about adaptive management flexibility. And would you agree that adaptive management flexibility for our public land management agencies is a key tool to protecting the concept of shared use? And what specifically are your thoughts in that regard?
Well, thank you for the warm welcome, Representative Lewis. Adaptive management, and adaptive you're referring to ecological?
Correct,
Yep.
Mr. Chairman.
I think I put a premium on open space. One of my other hats I wear is I'm a planning commissioner in Teton County, a county 97% of which is federal land. Currently, we're redoing our comprehensive plan that oversees some of the private lands, that includes the path of the pronghorn that Mr. Ridgeway spoke to. So the thing what I would address is we're currently trying to encourage conservation easements in those places. So putting together tax incentives, land trades to be able to protect those areas is one adaptive way I look at to accomplish this goal.
Well, Mr. Chairman, that's music to my ears. I was involved in the Wyoming Stock Growers Agricultural Land Trust. And we hold, along with the other rangeland trusts in the West, the Partnership of Rangeland Trusts, or PORT, the largest number of rangeland conservation easements in the United States. And it's a magnificent testament to public and private efforts to conserve land, because, of course, wildlife doesn't know whether they're on public land or private land. They migrate according to habitual practices. So I'm delighted to hear you say that. Look forward to working with you on conservation easement issues and the tax advantages that were put into the Farm Bill last year made an enormous difference in our state of Wyoming in terms of adding to the number of conservation easements that were donated for the tax advantages by people who, but for the tax advantages, would not have been able to pencil out the opportunity to conserve land in that manner. So again, Mr. McCarthy, thank you so much for joining us. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And at the conclusion of this oversight hearing, thank you very much. And as this committee continues to explore this priority issue of climate change in the federal lands, I want to thank all our panelists today for a really excellent start. And so as we go through this, there's obvious things: examination of statutory issues, examination of regulatory issues, as this administration defines the issue of balance in terms of extraction and protection. That'll fit into the discussion we need to have here. And I think the important point is that in the impression that I have from all our panelists is this is a real issue, and it's got to be taken seriously and dealt with seriously. And thank you very much for an excellent start, and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you. You were coming. Meeting's